What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? The 24 hours before my dad passed, stage 4 lung cancer, he was in the ER and then the ICU, and we were unable to be with him because of hospital rules. My mother, sister, and myself had been texting and calling him all day and got no response. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of his ICU nurses who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed very quickly at 3:30 a.m. the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but then he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes and he was gone. Later that morning, while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule him for pickup at the hospital. And going through his bag of belongings the hospital had returned to us, his phone was still there, and I wanted to read all our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone and all our texts had not been read. Not mine or my mom and sister's. I thought this was so odd, but figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed a chat app I'd vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name, but it essentially works like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad had been chatting with a girl hourly for the last 24 hours, and as far back as I could scroll. He was calling her princess and telling her he loved her, and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on, why he was in the ER, etc. I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having, at the very least, an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger, and a week later I tracked the girl down and spoke to her, via DMs. He was her high school bus driver, and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he passed and was dating someone younger than his grandchildren, someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy, but it sure is a bad secret to live the rest of my life with. A secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I'd never found out. Oh man, that is absolutely devastating. Story 2. I don't know how disturbing this is. It turned out pretty fantastic for one, but not for another. I was adopted and told a silly magical story about my birth parents that most certainly did not seem true, even when I was a child. At 57, I learned I was the result of a college affair between a very seriously Jewish young man and a very Baptist young woman. She was rushed off to a home for wayward girls to give birth. They followed her there, many states away, begging her to keep me and live a life together, but their families both said absolutely not. Jewish people were not viewed as white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her marrying a non-white. Plus, she was a very committed Christian and did not want to convert to Judaism. So off I went, into another family. I recently discovered 3 lovely half-siblings, and we're all pro or semi-pro musicians and get along well. Never got to meet my mother. She passed away a year before I searched. My father is out of the picture and wants to be left alone, and I'm fine with that. I'm grateful for the love he gave me. It was enough. Another person that was in my non-bio family was also adopted. She was older than me. She tracked down her mom later in life, too. She was in a hospital and had been since the day she was born. She was born holistically disabled. Physical, mental, cognitive, learning, sensory. Endings to our search are not always happy. Story 3. She was my best friend for 7 years. We'd literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back to be closer with her after about a year. We had no real ties to the state we had tried out, so we said, who cares? Let's go back. She's basically family. We were also happy to be reunited. She was over almost every night for dinner. We all laughed and talked and had a good time. Best year of my life. And slowly she started trying to turn my husband and I against each other. Anytime we had an argument, like any couple does, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan B for us, that if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her and we'd live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her issues and how she wanted to have a kid just like him. She just needed a donor. This all happened at around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts and figured it out. She wanted to take his sample and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, knocking on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was so terrifying and panic-inducing that we ended up having to move and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I'd never had a friend like her. Only to find out that she cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. But yeah, that's my story. Husband and I are great now, by the way. Well, that's the weirdest thing I've read all day. Story 4. A work colleague appeared on the front page of a national newspaper for a life of fraudulent qualifications. He claimed medical and law degrees, was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, and was the CEO for a major health fund. He actually was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, but that and the health fund role were largely built on the fraudulent qualifications and a progression of jobs also based on these claims. In reality, the only qualification he actually held was as a mortuary assistant. Not even his wife knew. The fraudulent degrees had been gained when he was in the Army Reserves recruiting, and he had access to submitted position applications. He came undone when he applied for a government job and some flags were raised by the recruitment people. He tried to withdraw the application but didn't realize that an application for a government role has the same weight as a statutory declaration and cannot be withdrawn. It all went south very quickly, and he ended up doing jail time. Story 5. A former friend of mine from childhood was a youth pastor at a summer church camp. Turns out he was picking on young girls and teens both at camp and online after camp was over. Only reason I found out was back in 2011. He was in his late 20s at the time. One of the girls told her parents and the cops posed as her online while he was doing something disturbing into a webcam. The cop then convinced him to drive 3 hours to go meet up. When he showed up at the girl's place in the middle of the night, the cops were waiting and arrested him. He's now a convicted offender and did time in jail. The crazy part? Once he got out, he moved to Texas and married a divorcee that had kids. He's also now the dean of online studies at his church and is responsible for growing the number of students taking classes online. Story 6. While my cousin was walking around with her son in the woods, she came across a hunting stand. She climbed it and found a pair of binoculars. Sitting straight forward and lifting the binoculars to her eyes, she saw her own bedroom window. Let's be logical here. If it was a legit hunting stand, it was facing and closer than 500 feet to a residence, which is illegal, which means it had to come down with prejudice. If it was a spy, well, it had to come down with prejudice. When my brother and I visited not long after, she showed us where it was. We tore it down and literally wrapped it around a couple trees, vented to complete uselessness. I got an angry call the next day. Did you tear down a hunting stand yesterday? Yeah, I did. That was your uncle's. Her mother's brother. Turns out my cousin reported it to the family and they ignored the issue. When the uncle was asked, he said there was just an old treehouse out there. Even when he was exposed, they didn't really care. They were more upset about the damage we did. Suffice it to say, I've written off most of that side of the family. Story 7. When I was young, I had vague ideas about my uncle being dodgy. At family events such as weddings, etc., my parents would tell me and some of my cousins to stay away from him. When I was in high school and we were doing a lesson in citizenship class where we had to get pieces from a newspaper, no idea why, and I came across an article saying he'd been recommitted to Broadmoor prison. Went home and Googled him and found out he'd been in prison in the 80s for different crimes, and had been in and out of prison since for other offenses. He also tried to sue the Sun once for defamation since they printed something incorrect about him. He was awarded 1P by the court because it technically was defamation, but it was agreed that what they had printed couldn't have damaged his reputation any further. All I know is that he was in a halfway house for a long time. However, from what I've gathered, he was released around 5 years ago. Story 8. I found out when I was an adult that my mother didn't just abandon me one day after work, like I'd been led to believe. Turns out she had been mistreated. She said they took her wallet and made a disgusting comment about my picture inside. I would have been a toddler at this time, and she was just too scared to go home. She said they'd follow her. She said it when it was over and my stepdad took her to the hospital. They had to stitch everything back together down there. She spent that time away on and off the psych ward. My mom and I still have a rocky relationship for reasons beyond this, but I definitely understand her better. She's had issues with drinking and her mental health all my life, and I really think it's because she's never sought proper help for what happened to her. Underneath all that trauma, drinking, and grief is my mother. She's one of the most beautiful souls that'll ever walk this earth. For clarification, she stayed in my life. Just my grandparents raised me. There was a lot of other drama as well, but none of it worth getting into. Story 9. So my grandmother, who's been estranged from my family for a long time now for a multitude of reasons, has this weird thing where she has to share food with people. Are you ordering steak at the restaurant? Well, oh boy, she's got to order the same thing even if she doesn't like steak. Try her drink. It's really good. Take the first bite of chicken to let her know if it's any good. This always really annoyed me because I hate sharing food. One day I brought it up to my mom and she was like, oh yeah, grandma's afraid of being harmed, so she wants other people to try it first. So let me get this straight. Grandma thinks someone is trying to harm her, so she has me try the food first? And it makes so much sense looking back because she literally would not take a bite of anything she ordered until someone else had a bite first. Thanks, Grandma. Story 10. Before I answer this, I want to say that this doesn't have my permission to leave here. To make sense, you have to know I have PTSD, and with it comes severe memory loss, in my case. With that being said, on to the answer. My mom sat me down and told me she walked in on my grandfather mistreating me. No one is sure when it stopped. I always felt off and had anxiety or depression, but as soon as she told me, she also explained it happened to her. She knew he was a monster, yet continued letting me be raised by him. I had all the symptoms growing up. I told people growing up I knew something was wrong, and people told me I was a dramatic girl or that I was a liar. He reoffended a few years ago. That's when people started to believe me. Honestly, it's rough, and spending your whole life being invalidated, invisible, and just really alone. I'm in my 30s and still am very just lost and feel completely hopeless. I'm not sure how to move on. I apologize for the ramble. I've never written out how I felt. It's weird reading it. I'll probably remove this because I want to continue to stay invisible, but I saw others in the forum share their stories. Story 11. Not so much a secret someone shared with me, but comments someone has made about a particular case in the Midwest US. All I'm going to say is that a family member very close to me has consistently every so often made comments about a particular case that happened in the region they grew up in. The culprits were caught, but I believe little to none were found, and through the investigation, it was discovered that the victims were fed. My family members' comments have always been vague and don't incriminate them in any way or add new information. Yet it has always unsettled me, not just because of the infrequent consistency in which they do it, but the serious or hushed tone they say it in that gives me the impression they could know more than they lead on. Be it first-hand or second-hand info. To be fair, rumors spread like crazy in rural America. Doesn't help that at the time of the crime, this relative of mine worked at a factory run by another family member, another interesting character, an ex-biker. He always enjoys everyone's discomfort when they go into detail about the process of various animals, including pigs, usually at the dinner table. Anyway, this person has always been into true crime, and I don't think many crimes happen in the region they grew up in, which could explain their fascination. I just can't help but shake the feeling they know something and sort of want to share it someday. Maybe I'll prod next time I see them. Story 12. This may not be the most popular answer, but my elderly mother in another state would lie to me about her health and well-being. I always kept close tabs because she was in her 80s and everything appeared to be fine, till I got a call from her friend who filled me in on what was really happening. A lot of bad health stuff, it turns out. Long story short, ended up in assisted living, ultimately, as she needed it. I hear this happens a lot, as the elderly don't want to be put in a home, but in her case, she was literally on the verge of accidentally injuring herself. So, while it's unfortunate to have to go to assisted living, if she truly wanted to live as long as possible, it was necessary. And the place was quite nice anyway. Moral of this story, if your loved ones are elderly, do more than just take their word on how they're really doing if you're able. Story 13. Discovered that my own mother paid bribes to my then social services worker to make my life miserable. I was in foster care at a young age because she was mistreating me. I won't get into the details. I was under the state's protection, but suddenly got imprisoned without any reason. I had to endure other forms of mistreatment or revenge as well. Finally got a lawyer. He found all the evidence and got in court. She lost the small amount of legal custody she still had. The social services worker got fired and banned from his profession, and I got my emancipation. The judge was not amused. I'm 41 and she still tries to make my life miserable once in a while, even if I move. Can't wait for her to just end and live in peace. Story 14. Probably not the most disturbing thing in this thread, but I recently learned that my brothers and I are the product of her father's second family. Apparently, he had a first family and my mother lured him away from them. His firstborn son was his name Junior, and he apparently passed away in the 90s, about 10 years after he started a family with my mother. The guy I knew as my righteous and morally sound beacon in life straight up ditched his family for a new woman to start a new family. He never spoke to them again. I'll never look at my parents the same again. My older brother and I have gotten closer since finding out, which is cool, but it's so disturbing to me how much we were lied to. I'm really wanting to do a DNA test to see if I have any long-lost half-siblings or cousins. Story 15. In high school, I had a friend who I wasn't close with for long, maybe a semester, but we bonded over our mental health struggles at the time. Unfortunately, she ended it all, not long later, and it wasn't until years later I learned from her best friend what she was really going through. Her parents divorced because her father came out and she left with her father because she was also the same as him and her family had become hostile towards them. Her own brothers spray-painted words in their home and messed with their tires. She also had health issues that contributed to her depression, and one day, she had enough. Almost a year to the day she passed away, her brother also ended it all, presumably out of guilt. I was told the family was investigated, but the last I heard, her mother had started speaking at prevention events. Story 16. My best friend of 25 years confessed to me that they believed themselves to be a sociopath, but they said it like they were proud, followed by a joyous, "I don't give a care about anyone but myself." I immediately recoiled and began begging them to not believe that, and tried to cough up examples of the contrary. Over the next year or two, things got especially chaotic in our world, and I began to step back and observe them more closely. Over time, I realized that they were right. They dated and brought around the worst people imaginable, people that would try to ruin your life and turn all your friends against you if you expressed disapproval. After a mountain range of covert passive-aggressive treatment, one day I woke up to who they really were and moved them out of my life immediately. Bear in mind, there was a long, slow build-up to this. There was a spell of healing, which is still ongoing, and lots of holy cow moments in retrospect, but things have been great ever since. Story 17. My extended family on my mom's side has a strange practice of turning horrible family events into funny stories to tell at family gatherings and the like. I believe mostly as a way to deal with the trauma. The time my grandfather tried to harm my grandmother in their living room with the kids present, or when my mom got harmed for saying Billy D. Williams was hot, were among those stories, both of which were told at Christmas parties, even when I was very young. The only stuff that doesn't get turned into fun stories is the stuff that no one knows how to process and just wants to bury. And that stuff I've only got tiny glimpses at, probably for the best. The one that stands out is when my grandmother let slide that my grandfather was in a group and participated in lynchings and was really proud of how good he was at it. Or when I found out later in life that the only reason I saw him growing up when none of my cousins did was that he knew where my mom lived but not his other kids. That us not visiting wasn't an option, which did make sense, considering his house and everything that happened in it was, in retrospect, weird. Like hanging out with the mute grandkids of his new wife. Story 18. My mom traveled back to China to have the cancellation, and my parents hoped that I was too young to remember, but I did. Back then, I remember my mom visiting the doctor numerous times, getting ultrasounds taken and such, and she went back to China for several months, leaving just my dad and I in the US, and after she came back, she never talked about it. I asked her where's the little sister that was supposed to be born, and they just said something like she disappeared. When I was a teen and I learned about different things, I started to suspect she might have had a cancellation. I asked her about it, and she denied it, saying it never happened and I might be imagining things. Classic gaslighting. Only recently, over 30 years later, I asked my uncle about it, and he told me it was all real and she did get a cancellation because his sister and my grandma helped take care of her after. We lived in a very conservative state, and my parents were poor immigrants living off of my dad's measly grad school stipend and couldn't afford the procedure anyways. As for why they got the cancellation, the baby had tons of birth defects and wasn't going to make it anyways. Story 19. Finally, I can post this story in one of these. So, my now husband, engaged at the time, and I are teachers and did a couple-year stint in bush or rural Alaska. It was pretty intense, but a great adventure. Learned a lot we wanted and a lot we didn't. We befriended one of our colleagues, an older single man who seemed friendly enough. We would often go over for dinner and go hiking. He took on the role of an uncle figure for us. We stayed at his Airbnb or spare bedroom at his house in the city on vacation once too. Now, in her second year teaching, there he brings along this young woman at the start of the school year who claims is his niece, and she never leaves his house. He claimed she was having trouble living with his brother and she was taking classes online to graduate, and she confirmed this with myself and other women in the village. Fast forward to spring. She leaves for home separately from this man and people ask why. He claims she patched things up with his brother or her dad and went home. It turns out this girl was basically a girl he met online, and her father tracked her down after she contacted the local woman about her situation and sent a state trooper to escort her home. She had been reported missing for 8 months prior. Messed up part was, on top of going to court for that situation starting the following summer, he tried to coax another girl offline to live with him the following school year, and it turns out that entire chat history was a sting by the FBI. He's in prison now, until 2043. Anyways, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 20. My best friend in high school had a brother who was only a year older than her. I wasn't close friends with him or anything, but I always liked him when we were younger, in a friendly way. He was always goofy and seemed kind-hearted, even though he did consistently stay in trouble as a teen. He has had a serious drinking problem ever since middle school. I knew he had some problems, but I never thought he was a bad guy. Well, anyway, I lost touch with my friend for a few years after high school, but when we ran into each other a while back, we had a long catch-up session. While talking, I couldn't help but notice that she hadn't mentioned her brother at all. That is odd, considering that he has always been present in her life. So I asked about him. Apparently, her brother had mistreated someone when he was in his mid-20s. The boy's family found out about it and pressed charges against him. I was absolutely shocked. I knew he had some serious emotional issues, and I knew he had been dealing with misuse, but I never thought he would do something like that. At most, I imagined him being in and out of jail for random petty charges, or maybe even go to prison for a crime. I never thought this was the direction his life would take. A friend said that she thinks his issues make it extremely difficult to have healthy relationships with people his own age, that he feels safer socializing with people much, much younger. She told me that after the charges were pressed, he was an absolute wreck, as if he were going through a breakup with another adult. It wasn't the charges that bothered him. It was the fact that he seriously considered this kid to be his boyfriend and he didn't want to lose him. Not that this makes anything he did less messed up. It was just shocking to me to hear just how warped this guy I grew up with was, and I never knew it. All this time you think you know a guy. Story 21. Growing up, I had an estranged sister from my dad's first marriage, but never knew why she left. I was always told vague things. When my brother passed away, a relative went out of their way to contact her and invite her to the funeral. She called the house, and my father got on the phone with her in private. When he came out of the room, he said he was done with her and told her she had been mean to him on the phone and wasn't coming to the funeral. I was upset and angry because I wanted to meet my sister and I couldn't believe she would do something like that to my grieving father. Fast forward, I'm visiting a relative in Ireland, the same relative who had reached out to my sister way back when. We were drinking at a bar, and she let it slip that she was with my sister the day when she made the phone call, and it was my father who was mean to her. It made her cry in the coffee shop. She had her bags packed to go to her brother's funeral, and she didn't go back because of my dad. I literally saw red. Still haven't spoken to my sister, but my father now has 2 estranged children. Story 22. I discovered later on in life that a close family member of mine was mistreated by the older brother of my best friend, literally in the same room next to me. I was still young. I didn't know until later when I read an interview that said person has, and she explained the story. And the grim reality struck me that this act was happening literally feet from me, behind a closed door, while I played Final Fantasy VII. I called her up and told her how I recalled it and how terrible I felt. Silver lining, she was happy someone remembered the events leading up to it because she had half convinced herself it was partially made up, and so she never named names. To this day, she's not accused him because of the close ties between both families, but yeah. So when folks whine about, why don't women report, please consider the many reasons why someone may choose not to air it. To say do not associate with this person anymore is an understatement. Story 23. I have almost zero interaction with my wider family. They're worthless to me. I only keep my mom and dad and one brother close. The rest are schmuck or have no interest in me. I've learned the hard way not to trust people and lost money, time, or mental freedom on them. No more. I don't mind losing touch with them. They're worthless to me and allowed terrible things to happen to my father, their brother. And when my grandfather passed, they allowed the poor treatment to continue even though they knew it was spiteful because he was a stepson and only their half-brother. All the money my step-granddad had and the house he owned was gifted to my grandmother to look after my father by his true family. She passed away when I was young. All the money was left to her husband. When he passed away, in the will all the grandkids got money and all the sons and daughters got money apart from my family because we weren't related, even though the money was meant for us. It didn't work. He lived off that money. The house was paid for. It wasn't paid by him. It was all the money left for my father and his mother to care for him. Then they reached out to say, let bygones be bygones. Nope. You perpetuated hate and the money you took was left by my father's real family to look after him. Your father was just a usurper and stole my father's inheritance. That's terrible. His grandmother should never have left the money to her husband. People forget that money corrupts and her husband was not her son's father. Story 24. A friend told me she had a history of being mean, as well as meddling in marriages. She claimed she was young and immature and past it. Then she started dating a friend. I got to witness elements of her attitude firsthand. Tried to protect the dude, tried to talk to him about it, but he'd hear none of it. Full denial of being mistreated, because it hadn't gotten worse at that point. Then she started meddling in the marriage of another friend while still in this relationship. In addition, uncomfy moments with me that the culmination of these things made me realize there's a good chance that she may be an actual sociopath. What disturbed me was the complete lack of remorse and the level of manipulative control she had over others, men in particular. Story 25. My father cheated on my brother's mother with my mom. My mom didn't know. They married and had me on the first year anniversary of being married. He started cheating on my mom with multiple women. And even when he was visiting my mom, my grandma, on her end from cancer, he met up with some women to mess around with. While my mother and I went back to our homestay while he buried his mother. After he left my mom, he remarried in Mexico with someone who was the same age as my brother. First marriage. He passed away in 2011 of a heart emergency in the freeway. Managed to park himself while having it. My brother and I had to pick up his stuff and we looked through his phone. And can you guess it? He was cheating on his current wife who lived in Mexico. The names in those phone numbers were for his boss, lawyer, and some other names. We looked through those messages and we're not surprised. So we did him one final solid and erased everything from his phone. This man was a player till he passed. Scumbag, yes, but his past, from what I heard, was pretty bad. But I think that is for another post. Story 26. A lot to unpack with this one. But when I was in high school, I discovered my father's stash of DVDs, and honestly, I would have kept quiet about it had it not been mostly extreme. Anyway, this opened a giant can of worms. My mother confronted him, and it turned out that he'd been having random meetups with men and women for the last 10 years. Think that's all? Nope. One of those meetups was his own cousin who had a serious drinking problem. He then used that meetup to blackmail the man into giving him money for years. There was absolutely no reason to do this. My dad had a fantastic job which paid great money. Am I finished? Nope. My parents obviously split up and then my dad became quite sick very shortly afterwards. Turns out he had AIDS, which he contracted years prior, HIV, and knew about it all that time. Everyone in my family had to be tested, including my younger brother who was only still young at the time. Thankfully, and most unbelievably, we all tested negative, including my mom. Surely I'm finished now. Nope. My dad met another woman and relapsed. Started drinking and doing stuff again, lost his job, eventually lost the house he was staying in with her and became homeless. Like living on the street type homeless. And just one more thing. When they broke up, her daughter told her that my father had been mistreating her. We all stood behind the family and gave statements, etc. to the police. This led to my brother also finding the courage to tell us that our dad also mistreated him for a number of years. His laptop and phone were seized and images were found on them. And you know where he is now? Well, neither do we. The police literally knew where he was and was ready to make an arrest, but decided not to because it's a Sunday. That was a few years ago and he's been hiding ever since. On the outside, this man was a professional guy with a great job. Always very caring and charming, people loved him, and yet he's the biggest monster I've ever known. Hopefully he's miserable. Story 27. My soon-to-be ex-husband lied about having cancer twice. He did it to cover for affairs. The first time, he guilted me, saying he had to leave town for treatment because I was too weak to be able to handle it and he needed his strength to stop cancer, not take care of me. I hated myself for being weak. Turns out he was really just out of town messing around with someone else while I was home being a single mom for 6 months. He duped all our friends, family. He even told his boss that he had days to weeks to live. I have texts to a friend of his talking about being sick from chemo, but the dates lined up to when we were at a hotel together having a romantic long weekend together. He didn't tell me the cancer returned till a month later, but he's never had cancer, never even tested for possible cancer. He let me, our children, our families and friends all cry, worried, etc. over his diagnosis, and it was a scam. Twice. I'll never get over that pain. It was unbearably cruel. Story 28. All right, this is going to be a long one, and a lot of context is needed, along with some ugly things I learned along the way. So about 6 to 7 years ago, I was in a difficult situation with housing. I live in a city where housing is prohibitively expensive and in demand, and I just found out that the letting agency was renovating the place and moving me and my former flatmate, whom I hated, out. Posted looking for new flatmates, and this guy asked to meet me to see if he could sort something out. I know this guy from anime cons. Seldom a good start, I know. And I chatted with him a couple of times and had a few drinks with him. We were friends on Facebook. He had been good friends with great friends of mine. We sat down for some Chinese food and talked. He proceeds to tell me that he has dissociative episodes, wakes up not knowing where he has been or what he's done. He says that he once woke up with red liquid in his hands and no idea how it got there. I smile and say something like, "Yeah, that's not ideal, man." While internally I'm like, I'm absolutely not moving in with this guy. Fast forward a few weeks and several of my friends make reference to an incident that happened at an anime con with this guy, but absolutely refuse to go into any kind of detail. There is apparently an ongoing investigation. I'm not really surprised, given the specimen, but a few years go by before I get a message from someone else I know telling me that I should unfriend this guy because he's just been convicted at an anime con in the side room and sentenced. Suddenly it all becomes clear. My mutual friends opened up to me. They'd known this guy since their early teens and they had been really close. When the event happened, he had told them that the girl had been making it all up and that he was innocent. They had, cautiously, wanted to believe their friend until it went to trial. So they said nothing during the investigation to anyone besides the authorities. They attended the trial and were horrified when absolutely incontrovertible evidence of his guilt was produced. It seems the girl he harmed wasn't even his intended target, but his target was in fact a girl one of my friends was dating at the time, whom he believed was leading him on after a prolonged dry spell. I don't know the victim, but I can only imagine the ordeal she went through. Needless to say, finding out that one of their best friends from their teens was a criminal also really messed up my friends. It gave me a first-hand view of how traumatic, messy, and complicated stuff like this can be. One girl who knew him, who said he couldn't believe he would do such a thing, received anonymous threats afterwards because they thought she was denying his guilt. He's in jail now and deserves to be. Stuff like this also brings out some of the worst in other people, too. Story 29. A friend of mine slept with her boyfriend's best friend when extremely intoxicated, and I think her third child is his, not the boyfriend's. Her and her boyfriend have 2 kids together, and this third kid looks like the boyfriend's friend, not the boyfriend. The first 2 kids have brown eyes and hair like both parents. The third is blue-eyed and ginger like the other guy. She's a childhood friend, and I would rarely see her. When she told me what happened, I did encourage her to tell her boyfriend. She told me while she was heavily pregnant, so I think she realized it was a possibility. It definitely was one time. She didn't imply it was forced or anything, but she used to be the kind of person who couldn't control their drinking and would end up in these situations as a teen. From what I heard of the situation, they were both incredibly hammered, though. The reason I haven't said anything is because they have kind of a weird relationship as it is. I don't know him that well, and I don't feel like it would help anything. They're dating, but they don't act like a couple, and they don't live together, and her boyfriend doesn't really provide for the 2 confirmed kids anyway. He was making a lot of money while my friend only had holy clothes to wear or was struggling to get by. I'm not really sure why they're in a relationship, but they are. It's public in his profile, too. Around the time the third baby was born, the boyfriend's dad also passed away. I don't think her boyfriend cheats, it's just a weird relationship. Although I'm very against cheating, I kind of feel like it's not really my place to rock the boat. Nothing is confirmed paternity-wise, and I'm not in contact with either of them in real life for the past few years. But every time I see that child, I remember her telling me what happened. Story 30. My archenemy in middle school was the daughter of a priest that worked for the school we attended. We absolutely disliked each other. My mother arranged for a sleepover with her, hoping we could work out our differences if we were one-on-one outside of school. I have no idea why she told me her family secret, but she did. That night, she told me her older brother and sister were intimate, and her parents caught them. They said they were in love and wanted to be together, so their father secretly married them to protect them from sin. She and I went on to continue our bad relationship that lasted until graduation, but I never told her secret. Allie, I hope you're living your best life away from your messed up family, even if you're mean. Story 31. While I was drinking with my grandparents last year, I mentioned how weird it was that my aunt had all this Christian or Jesus stuff going on. I noticed she had a hoodie that said, "Choose Christ," or something like that, and it confused me. My aunt and uncle are both pretty traditional secular. Then my grandma slipped up and said, "Oh, she got baptized after she ran over that man." The cat was out of the bag. My aunt apparently ran over an intoxicated guy on Halloween. He and his friends were jumping out in front of cars while dressed up, just to scare people in the spirit of the holiday. She couldn't press the brakes fast enough. There was a huge prejudice element involved afterwards because she got off without any charges as a white woman. The man was a Pacific Islander, and they fought hard for justice and never got it. Yeah, it's a messed up situation, and I feel horrible for both parties, and I love my aunt so much, but yeah, it was a dark family secret which was kept from me. Story 32. This isn't exactly disturbing, but equally as shocking. Throughout the time I knew my great-grandfather, up until around primary school when he passed, he never, ever talked about his time in the military. I was in World War I as a young boy, lied about his age, so fair enough. We knew he served. He was in a wheelchair due to wounds that he received, but that was about the extent of it. He never, ever spoke of it. Then when he passed, my parents were helping sort through his stuff and found a Victoria Cross, highest British military award for gallantry or bravery in the face of the enemy. They did some research and found out that my tiny, mild-mannered great-grandfather was at the Battle of the Somme, went over the top, and as he looked back to check on his mate, he got harmed. At the same time, his mate was harmed too. My great-grandfather crawled back to the British trenches, dragging his friend along. Both survived. He received a VC for this. However, he didn't even tell his wife, kids, or grandkids, etc. I guess he just didn't want the fanfare or praise over doing something anyone, or most people, would do for their friend. And he just didn't want to have to relive anything to do with that war. The lads back then were made of different stuff to people today, I swear. Story 33. Not a secret anymore, but still a story worth telling. My paternal grandmother passed away recently, and it just so happened to be the same day as my cousin's wedding. Mom's side. By some insane stroke of luck, my siblings both left for the wedding earlier than me and our parents, and my mom got the news while my siblings were gone. So I was told it happened, and then told I had to keep it a secret for the day so I didn't ruin the wedding. Fair enough. Well, during the reception, one of the guests, I believe someone's grandfather, started having some kind of episode and an ambulance had to be called. At first, we thought it could be a stroke, but thankfully it turned out to be low sugar, which is fairly easily taken care of. But anyway, while we were waiting for the ambulance to arrive and for the EMTs to do their thing, I'd gone out back to get a drink somewhere quiet. My brother came to the same area a bit later. We talked a bit and he ended up saying, "Wouldn't it be crazy if he actually passed away? Like, how weird would that be to happen today of all days?" I just couldn't say anything in response. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.